Let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, he is my song. You are good, good, oh, and you are good, good, oh, yes, you are good, good, oh, you are good, good, oh, let the King of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, he is my song. You are good, good, oh, you are good, good, oh, and you are good, good, oh, you are good, good, oh. Verse 1. Let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, he is my song. You are good, good, oh, you are good, good, oh, you are good, yes, God, you are so good. You are so good to us, and your ways are always good. God, we ask for eyes to see your goodness around us, in our lives, in our situations. Situations that don't look good. We ask that our eyes would be on you, God, who is always, always good. Thank you, Jesus. God, as we give you our praises and our offerings today, would you just receive them? What little we have, God, we bring to you. We love you. In your name we pray. Amen. Could we have the ushers for the morning offering?
Well, good morning, everybody. We've been going through the letter of Ephesians, and we've actually gotten to a part that is addressed to the kids this morning. Do we have any kids that like getting letters? Any kids that write letters or get letters? Anybody have a pen pal? Okay, we have a part of the letter of Ephesians that is now addressed to the children. So I need a child to come up here and read it. Oh, we have a brave one here. Go ahead, Bella. Come on up. Let me get you a mic here. There you go. You ready to read the part of the letter that's addressed to the kids?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Let me hold it for you right here.
Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Ephesians 6, 1 through 3.
Oh, can we give her a hand? Thank you. So I'm going to pray that it will go well with you guys down in junior church this morning. When the milk starts flying and the arms go flailing and they go into what I call spaghetti mode, it's like the limp noodle, you instantly know that something's wrong, right? And so we're going to look at that this morning and what the scriptures have to say, the scriptures have to say about those situations that every parent faces, the epic meltdown. My brother was telling me this the past week. You guys know the difference between a terrorist and a 2-year-old? You can negotiate with the terrorist. Okay, so we're going to look at that uphill battle that every parent faces. We're facing it right now with our own 2-year-old. Teaching them to obey and the responsibility that the parent has. And this is in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 2. And what Paul is doing here is he's actually quoting Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So this is the 5th commandment. It's the first commandment of the law that's given that has a specific promise attached to it. that your days may be long in the land. So it's saying basically, if you want to live a long and prosperous life, honor your father and mother. So we're not just talking about the little tykes here, okay? We have a lot of folks that have elderly parents and are caring for them and honoring them. And I've been amazed here in this church at the sacrifices that children make as they honor and care for their parents as they get older. And there's a lot of people here that have literally put their lives on hold in order to try and take care of their parents. And that's right. That's the right thing to do, to honor parents in that way. It's one of the basic commandments of the law. I think it's something where our culture, especially here in the United States, really struggles with this. I think a lot of times older people are shut away, and that's not what we're told is right here, to honor them and care for them. There's other cultures, the Asian cultures, the Middle Eastern cultures, that do a much better job of this, honestly, honoring parents. In the Middle East, it's the grandfather still has the say in the home as the patriarch, and if something's being discussed, everybody sits there and listens to him, and no one would dare to contradict him or dishonor him in that way. And it's also this idea of the people that have cared for us, okay, will need our care. That's just the basic building block of society. And so when a society ignores that, it causes, we know that something is really radically wrong. It's a sign of decay in a society when people aren't cared for and the most vulnerable aren't cared for. It's wrong, and it breaks one of the basic commandments of God, to honor your father and mother. Okay? Now, there's also an element of this passage that is addressed to those of us that still have the littles running around. And what it tells us to do is that it's addressing the children, telling them to obey, but this is also something that parents need to teach children to do. Teach them to obey while they're young. Don't delay. Teach them to obey. Teach them the way they should go while they are young, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. Don't delay. Teach them to obey. It's never too young to start instructing and disciplining. It doesn't get any easier if you put it off. And of course, it needs to be age appropriate. It needs to be done in love. We're specifically told in this passage in Ephesians not to provoke children to anger. I think some of us were probably influenced by the Dr. Dobson parenting books, and there's good elements to those books, but I would say the Dr. Dobson parenting movement of the 80s and 90s, which my own parents were influenced by, was about breaking that child's will, bending it to your own. And I think we're specifically told here in Ephesians specifically not to do that, not to provoke children to anger. And I think there's different ways that we can provoke children to anger. Instead, we're supposed to teach them the way that they should go, bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, and teaching them the calling that God has placed on their lives and with their giftings. Obedience is still certainly important and crucial and emphasized here. We want our children to live long and prosper. Why do we teach children to look both ways before they cross the road? Well, we don't want them getting run over, right? There's a lot of things that we teach our kids because we want them to live long. We teach them not to do drugs and because we don't want decades of their life cut off of their lives. That's why we teach them not to smoke, all these other things. There's just some basic truths here. And we're also given some, in this passage, I think some safeguards to what would be a more authoritarian or domineering parenting style. It tells us not to provoke kids to anger. So there's a guy named Kent Hughes. He writes one of the commentaries that I look at. He gives 4 ways, I'm going to add a 5th, of how we can provoke children to anger. Okay, number 1, you can provoke a child to anger through unreasonable demands. Okay? Telling my kids they have to pick up all the Legos when I am the one that has dumped the Lego bin out. Okay, that doesn't go over well in my household because it's an unreasonable demand, right? Dad, if you dump the Legos out and we're trying to play with us, you should help us pick them up, right? So there's one. Okay, number 2, you can provoke a child to anger by fault finding. Okay, looking for something to criticize your child for. Okay, if all they hear are negative words, they're going to be broken down instead of built up. Okay, and they'll turn that anger inside in self-destructive ways. Another way you can provoke a child to anger is neglect. You neglect a child, they will act out. This was David's big mistake with Absalom, and it drives him to rebellion and treason and attempted fratricide. Another way you can provoke a child to anger is inconsistency. Okay? And how can we be inconsistent in our parenting? I think disciplining in anger, okay? Disciplining in anger will make a child angry because it's inconsistent. There's another side of this too, I think, with consistency, is if they're doing something one day and they get away with it, and then they do that same thing another day and they get punished for it, that will also make a child angry because it's inconsistent. Okay? They need consistency. Consistency is also necessary when we make promises. If you promise your child that you're going to give them a reward when they do something good, and then they do or they obey, and then you don't give them that reward, that will also make a child angry. And I think the one that I would add on here at the end also is favoritism. You know, what happens when you give one child a special multicolored coat? Well, it makes all the other brothers pretty angry. Okay, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. So lots of ways we can provoke a child to anger as we attempt to discipline and instruct them. So what some people do is they just give up, right? Hands-off parenting approach. You know, don't want them getting angry, don't want their faces turning red, you know, so we're going to take a more laid-back, hands-off approach, let them do whatever they want. Okay, we don't want to hurt their self-esteem. Yeah, we don't use the word no in our house. Let them explore. Well, you're going to let them explore the electrical outlets and the wood stove and the gas range. You know, that would take years off of their life. Okay? No, we teach them to obey so they can live long and prosper in the land. Okay, we all know that's to be right. And Ephesians talks a lot about what's not right, what's not fitting, what's improper. It also tells us what is right, what's proper, and what is fitting. And it draws these contrasts. Okay, we teach them to obey because it's right. But I think there's also, when it comes to this contrast between what I would call permissive parenting and authoritarian parenting, I think what we're being told in this passage is neither of those. I think what we're being exhorted to is what I would call Christ-centered parenting. We discipline and instruct them in the Lord, okay? And the goal of parenting is not to form our children into mini-me's, okay? It's to train them up in the way that they should go, that they might mature to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So that's why we bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. The goal of them obeying us is that they might learn to obey Christ. And if we ever teach a child to obey us, but we lead them away from Christ, it would be better if we had a millstone hung around our necks and were tossed down into the bottom of the sea. And I could tell you failure after failure of my own parenting journey. If you really want to know, just ask my wife. But I was the more authoritarian parent. And it was, I think, having destructive effects in our family. And my wife made me aware of it. And she now wears more of the disciplinarian hat. So every family has to figure out how this works in grace, how to teach children to obey. But obedience is not the end goal. Okay? The end goal is Christ-like character in our kids. Okay, so don't lose sight of that. The next relationship that Paul explores here in this passage, so we've sort of got a 2-in-1 here this morning, is the and it's, again, looking at this house table of how things work in the household, okay, is in verse 5, and it talks about the relationships between bondservants and earthly masters. Okay, so Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5, bondservants, obey your earthly masters. Okay, and we'll get into the rest of it, but let's just stop right there. Earthly masters. That term right there, earthly masters or earthly lords, should give us a little bit of an idea of the way Paul is already thinking here. The fact that he's using a term like that, earthly masters, is already heads up about who the true master is, right? The Lord. And one of the things we have to realize here is the context. Paul's not writing to a wealthy, suburban, affluent church, okay? In the early first century church, not many of the people that came to Christ were powerful, okay, or of noble birth. God chose the low and despised in the world to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no human might boast in the presence of God. There were many bondservants and slaves in the early church. And Paul is addressing them, okay, first, don't miss that. And then he's going to talk to the masters. Okay, so don't miss how radical that is. Because what would typically be done in a letter of instruction is you write to the head of the household and you tell him how to get his house in order. And that's not what Paul is doing at all here. He is writing to those that are at the bottom of the totem pole first, instructing them. And so, and again, some of this we covered before, but we know that in Christ there's no longer slave or free. That Christ has turned all our relationships upside down. We looked at that last week. Okay, and it's important to keep in mind that it's Christians that eventually abolish slavery. There's an amazing movie about it, Amazing Grace, which is well worth the watch, and it covers some of that history. Okay, but here I want to look at the context that Paul was writing into. Okay, and what we have are whole households that are coming to Christ. And in a household, you would have often a master as well as bondservants or slaves in that household. And so I'm going to read a little bit of what Kent Hughes writes about that context. I think it's important to understand it as we look at this passage. He says that it's been estimated that there are around 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire around this time. And that as many as 1/3 of the population in cities like Ephesus would have been slaves or bondservants. And there were some common misconceptions. Again, I don't want to, there are many things that we learn about that period that tell us how horrible slavery is as well. Okay, but there are some misconceptions as well. One of these is that the average slave was subject to extreme exploitation. Kent Hughes writes, this simply was not so. To be sure, there was the traditional ancient teaching, such as in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, that a slave is a living tool. Again, I'm writing, these are the words that Aristotle used, an inanimate slave. Okay, Aristotle as well talked about a slave being a kind of possession with a soul. It's true that under Roman law, a slave was a thing to be owned, bought, and sold. Okay, it's also true that slaves did suffer terribly at the hand of owners at times. There's an account of a slave of Augustus who was crucified because he killed a pet quail. Okay, and there's also true that there had been major slave rebellions like those under Spartacus, but that actually happened several hundred years before what Paul is writing here. There had been some major reforms in the Roman society by that time. And so what we see here is that by the time of the Christian era and the writing of this Ephesian house table, there have been some sweeping changes that have been introduced that radically improved the treatment of slaves. Slaves under Roman law in the first century could generally count on eventually being set free. Almost 50% of slaves were freed before the age of 30. Okay, while a slave remained in his master's possession, he could own his own property, he could control his own property, he could invest and save to purchase his own freedom. Also, and this is what Kent Hughes writes, "We must also understand that being a slave did not indicate one's social class. Slaves regularly were accorded the social status of their owners. Regarding outward appearance, it was usually impossible to distinguish a slave from free persons. A slave could be a custodian, a salesman, or a CEO. Many slaves lived separately from their owners. Finally, selling oneself into slavery was commonly used as a means of obtaining Roman citizenship and gaining an entrance into society. Roman slavery in the first century was far more humane and civilized than the American African slavery practiced in this country much later. This is a sobering and humbling fact." Okay, so that hopefully, gives a little bit of a background as we start to look at this, because I don't want to do anything to dismiss the horrors of slavery, but I do want to look at what Paul is writing here and how that's, I think, actually is meant to influence our own relationships in the workplace. Because, in a workplace, you have a boss, right? And you've got to figure out how to get along with that boss. And there are some different strategies that people use, okay? You can suck up to the boss, okay? You can, do a really good job and be an excellent employee in that 1 month before your annual performance review, right? There are different things that people do. And they were doing them back then, in their bondservant relationship with their master. They're still practiced today. And so I think what Paul writes still applies when he talks about people-pleasing and eye service and other things like that. So we're going to look at it a little bit here, different ways of dealing with authority. Okay, and let's look at what is actually here in verses 5 to 8. Paul says, "Obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord." Okay, and there's a natural dynamic that was present back then, which is present now, is that when we're under authority, we tend to chafe, okay, under authority. And what Paul is saying here is don't chafe under authority. Submit yourself to it in fear and trembling out of your own reverence for Christ, okay? And it's very radical what Paul is saying here. It is viewing your boss as a Christ-like figure in your life as far as the service of the heart and the sincere heartfelt obedience that is given, okay? This is not the way we typically think, okay? I don't think most of us typically would view a boss as a Christ-like figure in our life. It's just not the way we operate. We tend to operate in other ways when it comes to authority. Giving eye service, being a people pleaser. Eye service is a service that's given when the boss's eye is upon you, right? And then when the cat's away, the mice play. Do whatever you want, slough off, okay? And then there's what we would call the people pleasers, and these are not the people you tend to like in your workplace, right? Because they're the people that, all they're trying to do is gain favor and power with the boss. And Paul is saying, no, that is not the way that we're meant to deal with authority. That's not an admirable quality. It's not the type of obedience that Christ calls us to. Instead, we're called to do the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. And we're going to get back to Joseph here. I think Joseph, when you think of his life, it would have been very easy for Joseph to live the majority of his life with a grumbling heart, when you think about it, really. Because he was, he actually started off with a position of privilege. He had, he was the favored one, okay? And then is betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a well, and sold as a slave. So you have these radical life circumstances completely out of his control, which turn him into a slave, okay? And he could have continued on as a slave with a grumbling heart. Oh, how I have been wronged. I can't believe this is my lot in life. To just go on with a grumbling heart. But that's not what we see in Joseph's life. He renders service as to the Lord. And then you think of what the Lord gives him back. He even gives him back his own brothers. So it's one of these amazing things that God does. It has to do with, I think, Joseph's heart and the way that he rendered service and the way that God blessed that. God's faithful. God sees everything done under the sun, even when the boss isn't looking. And that's what actually allows us to faithfully serve under authority that may not always be the best. And it's so we can keep our witness in mind and be light in the workplace instead of joining the grumbling masses. A radically different attitude when it comes to the workplace. And so now, after addressing the bondservants, Paul goes on to address the masters. Okay? And what he says is to the masters is in verse 9. Masters, do the same to them. He's talking about doing good. And stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. So what he's telling the bosses is remember who the real boss is, okay? And treat people right. And I think this also, is something anybody that's in a position of authority in the workplace has to keep in mind. I think we have to keep it in mind as we've had high inflation in the United States recently, right? What happens during periods of high inflation, okay, as inflation increases, economic disparity increases as well, okay? And that's something that employers have to keep in mind. You've got to treat people right. And bosses set the tone for the workplace, set the right one, do good, don't threaten. Paul's context, there were all sorts of threats that a master could use with a slave. Threaten them with sexual harassment, threaten them with beatings, threaten to sell off the father as to another family and part them from their families. And it's the coercive use of power. Okay, it looks a little differently in our society today, but there are many bosses that still abuse their power. And Paul is saying, don't do that. Don't use power in that way. Don't be the big cheese who forgets who the real boss is. Okay, God sees everything done under the sun, and he doesn't care whether you've climbed the ladder to the top or whether you're slaving away at $13 an hour. He wants everyone in his church surrendered to him, regardless of the circumstances. And it's easy to get bitter about our lot in life. I think especially if you're at the bottom of the economic ladder, it's easy to let a grumbling attitude take place in the heart. And I think if you're at the top, it's easy to let a prideful attitude come in the way that you view and treat others. And Christ says, none of that in my church. Everyone follows me, from the least to the greatest. And he actually flips everything upside down. Whoever would be greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Okay? So as we think about Christ's death on the cross, okay, don't miss out on the way that is meant to impact our relationships with one another. Okay? It's easy to compartmentalize life. People do it all the time. Who you are at home, who you are at work, who you are during our nice little hour and a half or 2 hours here in church. But the real question is who you are, okay? Is your life really surrendered to Christ? Has that changed your marriage? Has that changed your parenting? Has that changed your workplace? Is Jesus someone real that changes your life? Do you submit to him? Do you surrender to him? That's what makes everything else fall into place. We don't remove him from these spheres of life. We let him reign over us and change us until we all attain to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Okay, that's the message here in Ephesians. Okay, that there is no area of life that is outside of his sovereign control. That there's not a single relationship that isn't meant to be impacted by him. Okay, that relationships of authority are meant to be fundamentally transformed by Him. So don't miss out on how life-altering, these instructions here at the end are. When we let Christ in, He can work miracles in our relationships. When we shut Him out, it is dog eat dog, And we have all this brokenness that gets brought into our lives because of our own selfish attitudes instead of the healing that comes when we have the selfless attitudes of Christ. Will you submit to Him? Will you surrender? He wants to invite you into His school so that you can be taught by Him. His way. It's not the world's way. It's radically different. It's radically better. So may you taste and see that the Lord is good. May His goodness permeate all of the relationships in your life. It is a sweet, sweet surrender. And what it does is it gives you something that no one else can ever take from you. The kingdom of God within you. So may His kingdom spread here in our midst. May it spread outside of the doors of this church. We see a lot of brokenness around us, right? This state is lost. It's one of the most lost places on earth. And it desperately needs the Lord. It needs His healing. And because people have abandoned God's plan for relationships in life. So in Christ we are a healing balm. So may our faith be applied in a way that actually brings healing to those around us. We ask this with the power of the Spirit, and we ask this in the Father's name. Amen. Cleola wanted me to remind parents that there are the 2 meetings for junior church and for the Christmas program after right now. And she wanted people to go down right away to those.